Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The unsettling correspondence. It was on a bleak November morning that I, Dr. John Watson, found myself once more in the familiar surroundings of 221B Baker Street. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, offering a meagre respite from the chill that crept through the fog-laden streets of London. Holmes sat in his habitual pose, draped in his dressing gown, a pipe smouldering between his fingers, and his keen grey eyes fixed upon a letter he held with evident interest. "Watson, my dear fellow," he said without shifting his gaze, "I trust you have no urgent appointments at your practice today." I knew from experience that such a question was merely rhetorical. Holmes never inquired unless he had already resolved upon my involvement. "None that cannot wait," I replied, taking a seat opposite him. "Do we have a case?" He tapped the letter with a long, slender finger. An intriguing puzzle, one that Scotland Yard has, unsurprisingly, deemed beyond their competence. He handed me the note, and I read the following lines, scrawled in a trembling hand. "Mr. Holmes, I am in grave peril, though I cannot say from whom or why. A letter arrived at my residence 3 days ago, and since then I have been consumed by a terrible malaise. My physician is baffled, and I fear my hours are numbered." The note contained nothing but a single line. "Your sins shall find you out. I implore you to visit me at once, before it is too late. Reginald Stamford, 12. Belgrave Square." I looked up at Holmes, who was watching me with a faint smile. "Surely you do not believe the letter itself could have caused this man's affliction?" "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must determine," Holmes said, rising abruptly and reaching for his coat. "A case in which the very act of reading may prove fatal. How delightfully singular! Come, the game is afoot." With that, we stepped out into the fog-bound streets of London, unaware that we were about to embark on one of the most baffling cases of our careers. The man on the brink. A hansom cab carried us swiftly through the mist-shrouded streets of London, the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoing through the damp air. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, while I pondered the unsettling nature of Reginald Stamford's letter. "You seem troubled, Watson," Holmes remarked, breaking the silence. "Pray, share your thoughts." "It is the urgency of the note," I admitted. "The man believes himself dying, yet he does not know why. Could his illness truly be linked to the letter he received?" Holmes exhaled a thin plume of smoke from his pipe. "A curious case indeed. The phrasing, 'Your sins shall find you out,' suggests an accuser rather than a mere misfortune. But whether it is a warning or a sentence remains to be seen." Moments later, we arrived at 12 Belgrave Square, a stately residence with a grim stillness about it. A liveried butler, his face pale and strained, admitted us without question. "Mr. Stamford is expecting you, sir," he murmured. "But I must warn you, he is much altered. The doctor has been and gone, baffled by the ailment." We were led through a richly furnished hall and into a dimly lit chamber, where a frail figure lay propped against a mound of pillows. Reginald Stamford had once been a man of impressive stature, But now he was reduced to a shadow of himself, his skin sallow, his breathing laboured, his eyes, sunken and bloodshot, flickered toward Holmes with desperate hope. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you came," he rasped. I do not have long." Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping over Stamford's form with clinical precision. "You will forgive me, sir, if I forego pleasantries. Time, it seems, is not in our favour." Stamford gave a weak chuckle. "Nor is it on my side," he murmured. Holmes leaned in slightly. "Tell me everything and omit nothing. When did you first feel unwell?" "Hours after receiving that cursed letter," Stamford whispered. "It arrived by post, unsigned, and with no return address. At first I dismissed it as the work of some petty blackmailer. But then this sickness took hold. It feels as if my very blood has turned against me." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning strength. "No food stays. Down. My limbs feel heavy. My mind is slipping." Holmes did not reply at once, but instead reached into his pocket and produced a magnifying lens. He moved closer, scrutinizing Stamford's hands, his lips, the whites of his eyes. Then, with the lightest touch, he examined the letter resting on the bedside table. He did not pick it up, only observed it, as one might a coiled snake. "Watson," he said without turning, "your medical opinion. What do you make of this?" I stepped forward and checked Stamford's pulse. It was erratic, weak. His skin felt clammy, and there was a peculiar bluish tinge to his lips, an ominous sign. "This is no ordinary illness," I murmured. "Poison, perhaps." Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps." He turned to Stamford. "One final question, sir. Have you any enemies?" A flicker of something, fear, perhaps guilt, crossed Stamford's face. His lips parted, but before he could utter a word, a violent shudder coursed through his body. He convulsed, his breath hitching in his throat. Watson rushed forward, but it was too late. With a final strangled gasp, Reginald Stamford collapsed, back onto the pillows, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. The room fell into a heavy silence. The butler, who had been hovering anxiously near the doorway, let out a horrified gasp. Holmes, however, was already in motion. He seized the letter from the table, scrutinizing it under the dim light. Then, with the barest of smiles, he murmured, "The game, my dear Watson, is not over yet. It has only just begun." The clue in the ink. Reginald Stamford lay still, the last traces of life having fled his body. The butler, pale as a spectre, gripped the doorframe for support, his mouth opening and closing, as if seeking words that would not come. "He's dead," he whispered hoarsely. Holmes straightened from his position beside the bed, his expression one of detached scrutiny. "Yes," he said quietly, "and now the real work begins." I cast him a sharp look. "Holmes, have you no sense of propriety? The man has only just passed." He waved a hand dismissively. "And what good shall mourning do him now? If he was murdered, as I suspect, we owe it to him to find his killer with all due haste." I could not argue with that logic, though I found his lack of sentiment unsettling. Turning back to Stamford, I conducted a brief examination, checking for any further signs of what might have caused his rapid decline. His body was still warm, his pupils dilated, his skin a sickly hue. Holmes, meanwhile, had retrieved a pair of tweezers from his coat and was holding the letter up to the dim light of the gas lamp. He tilted it at different angles, watching as the ink caught the glow. After a moment, he nodded to himself and carefully placed the letter in an envelope. "What do you see?" I asked. "Not yet, Watson," he murmured. "First, a question. Mr. Stamford's butler. What is your name?" The man, still visibly shaken, managed to straighten his posture. "Grayson, sir." "Good. Grayson, tell me, who else has handled this letter?" Grayson swallowed hard. "Only Mr. Stamford himself, sir. It arrived in the afternoon post. He read it in his study and left it on his desk. I don't believe anyone else touched it. And you did not notice any immediate reaction from him?" "Not at first," Grayson admitted. "But an hour or so later he called for me, saying he felt unwell. By nightfall he could barely stand. It got worse with each passing day." Tezet nodded thoughtfully. "A slow-working poison, then. Not ingested, but absorbed. And the letter, I suspect, is the murder weapon." "A poisoned letter?" I asked in astonishment. "A most ingenious method," Holmes said. "Had Stamford burned it, or discarded it unread, he might have lived. But the ink, yes, Watson, the ink was no ordinary ink at all." I stepped closer, peering at the letter. "It looks perfectly ordinary to me." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "which is what makes it so extraordinary. Tell me, have you ever heard of tetrodotoxin?" I blinked. "The deadly toxin derived from pufferfish? It attacks the nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure. But it is exceedingly rare." Holmes smiled grimly. "Rare, yes, but not impossible to procure, especially by one with knowledge of such matters. If my theory is correct, the ink contains traces of it, designed to be absorbed through the skin." I exhaled sharply. "A most insidious method of murder." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, slipping the letter into a protective case. "And one that tells us something rather crucial about our killer." Grayson frowned. "And what is that, sir?" Holmes turned, his sharp gaze glinting in the lamplight. "That they are both patient and calculating. This was not an act of passion, but of precision. The victim was meant to suffer, to feel the slow creep of death without understanding its cause. No ordinary criminal could conceive of such a scheme." The butler shivered. "Then what kind of man are we dealing with, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes exhaled, reaching for his pipe. "That, my dear Grayson, is precisely what we must uncover. But first, Watson, we require a chemist. The ink must be tested." "And where do you propose must we go?" I asked. Holmes grinned. "Why, to the only man in London who could concoct such a poison without raising suspicion." I frowned. "And who might that be?" Holmes took a long draw from his pipe and exhaled slowly. "Professor Elias Weatherby, Bézieux, the chemist in the shadows." The cab jostled through the gaslit streets of London as Holmes and I made our way toward Lambeth, a district known for its industrial smoke, hidden laboratories, and men of questionable ethics. The name Professor Elias Weatherby was unfamiliar to me, but Holmes spoke it with a weight that suggested the man was no ordinary scientist. "You seem to know this Weatherby well," I remarked, adjusting my coat against the night's growing chill. Holmes tapped his fingers against his knee, his gaze fixed beyond the window. I have encountered his work before, though not in the capacity of friendship. Professor Weatherby is a chemist of singular brilliance, a man whose knowledge of poisons rivals the greatest toxicologists of Europe. If anyone in London has handled tetrodotoxin, or something akin to it, it would be him, and sure. And he is not under the scrutiny of the law? Holmes let out a dry chuckle. The law, my dear Watson, often lags behind the cleverest of men. Weatherby operates under the guise of pharmaceutical research, but I have long suspected his dealings extend into murkier avenues. The cab came to a halt outside a narrow, unremarkable building with darkened windows. A single brass plate beside the door bore the name Professor Elias Weatherby, Specialist in Rare Compounds. Holmes rapped sharply on the door. A few moments passed before it creaked open to reveal a wiry man in his late 50s. He had deep-set eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, and an expression that flickered between curiosity and mild irritation. And Henshio's gaze lingered on Holmes before he spoke. "Mr. Holmes, this is a rare pleasure." Holmes stepped inside without invitation, motioning for me to follow. "A pleasure indeed, Professor, though I fear this is no social call." Weatherby shut the door behind us. The room smelled of chemicals, ink, and something faintly metallic. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with glass vials, books, and instruments of alchemical precision. A large wooden desk stood at the centre, cluttered with papers and half-finished experiments. "I assume you are here for something specific," Weatherby said, folding his hands behind his back. "Or is this a general inquisition?" Holmes produced the sealed letter from his coat and placed it on the desk. "Examine this, if you please, the ink in particular." Weatherby arched an eyebrow, but retrieved a small magnifying lens. He tilted the letter under a lamp, scrutinizing the script with practised eyes. "Curious," he murmured. "Very curious." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you recognize it?" "Recognize?" Weatherby smiled faintly. "No, but I recognize certain qualities. The ink contains more than simple dye and gall extract. There are minute crystallizations, residue of an additive. Bézier, can you determine what it is?" I asked. Weatherby nodded, already reaching for a small dropper. He extracted the faintest trace of ink from the letter and transferred it onto a glass slide, setting it beneath a microscope. We watched in silence as he adjusted the focus, his eyes narrowing. Minutes passed before he spoke. "This," he said, "is no ordinary ink. It has been treated with a compound that reacts upon skin contact. A nerve agent, I would wager." He glanced at Holmes. "And if I am not mistaken, something in the family of tetrodotoxin." Holmes gave me a knowing glance before turning back to Weatherby. "Tell me, Professor, how many men in London possess the knowledge to create such a thing?" Weatherby removed his glasses and wiped them with a cloth, considering his response. "A handful, perhaps, but few with the means to do so without attracting attention." He studied Holmes carefully. "You suspect foul play, then? A man is dead," Holmes said simply. Weatherby sighed. "Then I will tell you what I can. Whoever prepared this ink had access to a controlled supply of toxins, likely from an exotic source. Tetrodotoxin is not something one purchases at a chemist's shop. It would require either a highly specialized laboratory or an individual with connections to overseas trade. Holmes finished. Precisely. Weatherby nodded. The toxin's origin would point to either the Far East or the West Indies, where such substances are known to be harvested from certain marine creatures. Holmes tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. Then, abruptly, he turned. To me, Watson, do you recall Stamford's final expression before he died? I frowned at the question. Fear, I said. He looked as though he wanted to confess something, but was unable to speak. Holmes nodded. Precisely. And now we must find out what that something was. He turned back to Weatherby. Thank you, Professor. Your assistance is most illuminating. Weatherby inclined his head. If this case is as grave as you suggest, Mr. Holmes, then I suspect you are walking a dangerous path. Holmes smiled thinly. Wouldn't be the first time. As we stepped back into the cold London night, I turned to my companion. What now, Holmes? He lit his pipe, eyes gleaming with anticipation. Now, Watson, we visit Stamford's past. Somewhere, in his life, he made an enemy. And that enemy has finally come to collect. The shadow of the past. As we stepped out of Professor Weatherby's dimly lit study, the cold air of the London night wrapped around us like a shroud. Holmes, deep in thought, strode ahead with purposeful steps, his coat billowing behind him. I hurried to keep pace. You suspect Stamford's past holds the key to his murder, I said, voicing the conclusion I had drawn from our last conversation. Quite so, Watson, Holmes replied. A poison of this nature is not administered on a whim. It speaks of careful planning, patience, and a long-standing grudge. Our next course of action is clear. We must uncover the precise skeleton in Stamford's closet that led him to such an untimely demise. And how do you propose we do that? Holmes smiled faintly. By consulting those who knew him best. The dead tell no tales, my dear Watson, but the living, they betray secrets in the most curious of ways. A visit to the Stamford estate. We arrived at Stamford's townhouse in Belgravia shortly before midnight. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows along the cobblestone path. The butler, Grayson, answered the door with weary eyes. "You have returned, gentlemen," he murmured, stepping aside to let us in, "though I fear there is little more I can offer you." Holmes removed his gloves, tucking them into his coat pocket. "On the contrary, Grayson, you are precisely the man I wish to speak with. Tell me, how long have you been in Mr. Stamford's service?" 10 years, sir." "Then you would know of any peculiar dealings he might have had. Any old acquaintances, perhaps, who brought him trouble?" Grayson hesitated. Mr. Stamford was a private man, but if you ask whether he had enemies, I cannot say for certain, though there was one name I recall hearing in hushed tones, never in my presence, mind you, but in passing conversations. Holmes leaned in slightly. "And that name?" Grayson's voice dropped to a whisper. "Edwin Calloway." Holmes shot me a glance. The name meant nothing to me, but I knew my companion's mind was already racing ahead, sifting through the archives of his memory. "And who is this Calloway?" I asked. "A man from Mr. Stamford's past," Grayson said carefully. "I do not know the nature of their relationship, but there was a time when the very mention of the name would cause Mr. Stamford's face to darken. Holmes steepled his fingers in thought. "And when was the last time you heard it spoken?" Grayson hesitated. 2 weeks ago. Mr. Stamford had been restless that evening, pacing in his study, muttering to himself. I overheard him whisper, "Calloway, so it is not over." But when I inquired, he dismissed my concern. Holmes exhaled, slowly. Fascinating. A chill passed through me. If Calloway was an enemy from Stamford's past, could he be the one behind the poisoned letter? Holmes tapped his fingers against his chin. "It is a compelling theory, Watson, but we lack proof. Stamford's fear suggests he believed Calloway to be a threat, but we must ask, what was the nature of that threat?" He turned to Grayson. "Do you know where we might find this Edwin Calloway?" The butler shook his head. "I only know that he and Mr. Stamford were once connected through business. Something overseas, I believe." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "Overseas, you say?" "Yes, sir, but beyond that I cannot say." Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door. "Come, Watson," he called over his shoulder. "I believe it is time we paid a visit to the London Shipping Registry. The man from the sea." The gas lamps burned dimly along the Thames as our cab clattered toward the London Shipping Registry, a vast archive of maritime records that chronicled the comings and goings of every vessel that passed through British waters. The air was thick with the scent of river fog and coal smoke, the murmur of distant ships lapping against the dockside. Holmes sat opposite me in the cab, his fingers steepled, eyes flickering with thought. "Watson," he said at last, "we are closing in on our quarry. Edwin Calloway is not merely a name whispered in fear. He is a spectre from Stamford's past, a man whose grudge has festered long enough to turn to murder. The key lies in their connection, and I suspect it is tied to the sea. You believe their business dealings were maritime in nature?" I asked. "Precisely. Grayson's mention of overseas affairs suggests an enterprise beyond Britain's borders. If Stamford wronged Calloway in such dealings, we must determine when and where. The shipping registry holds records of all registered traders, captains and vessels. If Calloway was a man of the sea, his name will be there." Moments later, our cab halted before a squat brick building overlooking the river. A single lamp burned at the entrance, casting a faint glow over the worn steps. Holmes pushed open the heavy oak door, and we entered. The ledger of secrets inside, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and ink. Rows of shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with meticulously kept ledgers detailing the trade routes, ship ownerships, and maritime dealings of the past decades. A lone clerk, a balding man in spectacles, looked up as we approached. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted, recognizing my companion at once. "A rare sight at this hour." Holmes offered a brief nod. "Mr. Hughes, your diligence at keeping London's maritime records intact is precisely why I find myself at your door. I require information on a man named Edwin Calloway, his past dealings, his ships, and any connections he may have had to Reginald Stamford." Hughes pursed his lips, adjusting his glasses. "Calloway, Calloway. The name does ring a bell." He turned toward the shelves, running a practised finger along the spines of ledgers. After a moment, he plucked a heavy volume from its place and set it before us. Here we are, shipping records from 12 years ago. If he was a registered trader or captain, he will be listed. Holmes flipped through the pages with swift precision, his eyes scanning each line with methodical care. Then suddenly, his hand stilled. "Watson, look here!" I leaned in, following his finger as it traced a name. Edwin Calloway, co-owner of the merchant vessel Raven's Crest. Beneath it, another name stood out, sending a chill through me. Reginald Stamford. Co-owner Holmes tapped the entry. So they were not merely business associates, they were partners. And yet Calloway's name vanished from the records after 1878, I observed. What happened? Hughes cleared his throat. Ah, yes, the Raven's Crest, a ship of ill repute. She was lost at sea in 1878, presumed wrecked in the Caribbean. Stamford returned to London shortly after, but there was no sign of Calloway. Most assumed he perished in the wreck. Holmes's gaze darkened, or so Stamford wished people to believe. I felt my breath catch. You think Calloway survived? It would explain much, Holmes mused. A man left for dead, returning years later to exact his vengeance. But there remains one question, Watson. And what is that? Holmes exhaled slowly. If Edwin Calloway perished at sea, then who sent the poisoned letter? A silence fell between us, the implications heavy. If Calloway had truly returned, he had waited over a decade to strike. If he was dead, then someone else, someone with access to his name, his grudge, had assumed his vendetta. Holmes snapped the ledger shut. We need to find out what truly happened aboard the Raven's Crest that fateful year. And for that, Watson, we must speak to the only other man who may know the truth. And who might that be? Holmes smiled grimly. A sailor never sails alone. We must find a surviving crewman of the Raven's Crest. The Survivor's Tale. A cold wind howled through the narrow streets as Holmes and I emerged from the London shipping registry. The revelation of Edwin Calloway's partnership with Stamford and the lost fate of the Raven's Crest had cast a new shadow over the case. Holmes's expression was unreadable as we made our way toward a waiting cab. "You believe a crewman from the Raven's Crest still lives?" I asked as we stepped inside. Holmes nodded. "It is a certainty, Watson. A ship is rarely lost without at least one survivor, and if Stamford returned alone, there were either others left behind, or others who never made it back to tell their tale. If we can locate such a man, we may finally uncover what transpired on that voyage. And where do you propose we begin our search?" Holmes rapped his knuckles against the cab's wooden frame. "To the Anchor's Rest in Whitechapel," he instructed the driver. Then, turning to me, he added, "If any man from that ill-fated crew survived, he would seek refuge in familiar waters. The dockside taverns have long been the gathering places of those lost to the sea." The Anchor's Rest. The Anchor's Rest was the sort of establishment where men drank to forget, rather than to celebrate. A low, smoke-choked ceiling hung over a crowd of weathered sailors, their faces lined with salt and sorrow. The scent of ale and unwashed bodies filled the room, mingling with the faint brine of the nearby Thames. Holmes strode in without hesitation, his sharp eyes scanning the patrons. He approached the barkeep, a burly man with a missing tooth, and slid a sovereign across the counter. "We seek word of any man who once sailed aboard the Raven's Crest," Holmes said, "preferably one still drawing breath." The barkeep's brows furrowed. "That's a cursed name to be speaking here, sir. That ship went down years ago. Nothing but bad luck for those what sailed her." "None the less," Holmes pressed, "a survivor." The man hesitated, then jerked his thumb toward the far corner of the room. "If there's any left, it'd be old Tobias. He was a deckhand aboard the Raven's Crest. Hasn't sailed since. Drinks away his ghosts here most nights." Holmes and I turned toward the indicated table, where a man hunched over a half-empty tankard. His once powerful frame was reduced to gaunt frailty, his beard unkempt, and his skin weathered like a ship's hull battered by years of storm. His rheumy eyes lifted at our approach, narrowing with suspicion. "You ain't from the docks," he rasped. "What do you want with me?" Holmes took the seat opposite him. "And sure, sir, we wish to hear about the Raven's Crest, Mr. Tobias. We know you were aboard when she was lost." The man's hand tightened around his tankard. "Who's asking?" "Someone interested in the truth," Holmes replied, "and willing to pay for it." He placed another sovereign on the table. The glint of gold stirred something in Tobias's hollow gaze. After a long silence, he exhaled a breath that reeked of rum. He muttered, "I sailed on the Raven's Crest, but that ship was damned from the start." "Damned how?" I asked. Tobias's hands trembled slightly as he took another swig of his drink. "It wasn't no ordinary trade voyage," he said. "Cap'n Calloway and Stamford, partners they was. But Stamford, he had a hunger for gold. He struck a deal with men best left alone." "What kind of deal?" Holmes pressed. Tobias's gaze darted around the room as if fearful of unseen ears. "They took on cargo in the West Indies, contraband, some said. But it weren't just goods they were hauling. There were rumours, whispers, that Stamford had crossed men from the Bahamas, men who don't forgive a debt unpaid." Holmes exchanged a look with me. "And what of Calloway?" "Calloway?" Tobias let out a bitter laugh. "Calloway was a good man, but he weren't blind. He knew Stamford was playing a dangerous game. And when the ship went down, not all of us perished with it." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Some say Calloway survived. Some say he never forgave Stamford for what he done." The words sent a chill down my spine. "Do you believe Calloway is still alive?" I asked. Tobias's fingers twitched. "I believe ghosts walk where they got unfinished business. If Calloway's breathing, he ain't walking London for no pleasure." Holmes leaned in, his eyes sharp as a blade. "And if Calloway did survive, where would he have gone?" Tobias hesitated, then muttered, "If he made it back, he'd go where Stamford feared to tread." "And where is that?" The old sailor's lips parted as if to answer. But before he could speak, a sharp crack rang out. A gunshot. Glass shattered. A candle toppled, plunging half the room into shadow. Tobias let out a strangled gasp, his body jerking before he slumped forward onto the table. A dark stain spread across his chest. The tavern erupted into chaos. "Watson, down!" Holmes shouted, dragging me behind an overturned chair as another shot whistled past. Through the melee of panicked men and upturned tables, I caught a glimpse of a figure in a dark coat slipping out the door into the night. Holmes sprang to his feet. "After him!" I barely had time to check Tobias's pulse, weak but still alive, before I stumbled after Holmes into the cold London streets. The assassin was already disappearing into the fog, but Holmes was relentless, darting after him like a hound on a scent. "Someone does not want Calloway's story told," Holmes muttered as we pursued the shadow through the labyrinth of alleyways. "And that, Watson, tells us we are very close to the truth. The Phantom." In the fog, Holmes raced through the winding alleys of Whitechapel, his lean figure cutting through the swirling fog like a blade. I followed close behind, my heart pounding against my ribs. The crack of gunfire still echoed in my ears. The image of Tobias slumped over the tavern table burned into my mind. The shadow ahead of us darted between narrow passageways, barely more than a flicker against the shifting mist. Holmes moved with unerring precision, his sharp eyes fixed on the fleeing figure. "He knows these streets," Holmes muttered, glancing back at me. "A professional, no doubt, a hired hand, but even the cleverest rats can be flushed from their holes." We rounded a corner, emerging into a narrow lane lined with boarded windows and crumbling brick walls. The figure was already halfway down the passage, slipping into the gloom. Holmes abruptly seized my arm, pulling me into the shelter of a recessed doorway. "We shan't catch him by pursuit alone, Watson. The fog is his ally." I struggled to steady my breath. "Then how do you propose we find him?" Holmes's eyes gleamed beneath the brim of his hat. "By letting him reveal himself." He crouched low, plucking a stray stone from the cobbles. With a sudden flick of his wrist, he sent it clattering down the alley in the opposite direction. The sound echoed against the walls, sharp, deliberate. From the shadows ahead there was the faintest hesitation. A footfall stilled, a breath caught. It was enough. Holmes sprang forward like a wolf, closing the distance in a few swift strides. There was a muffled curse, a brief struggle. Then the dark figure crumpled to the ground beneath Holmes's grip. I hurried forward, striking a match to illuminate the narrow lane. The dim flame revealed a wiry man with pockmarked skin, his face twisted in pain beneath Holmes's iron grasp. His coat was torn, and a revolver lay half hidden in the folds. Holmes wrested the weapon from him and pressed it into my hand. "Hold this, Watson. Our friend here is unlikely to require it further." The man's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. "You've made a grave error tonight," Holmes said softly, "one I fear your employer will not forgive." The man's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Holmes crouched lower, his voice a mere whisper. "You were sent to silence Tobias. The question is, were you sent by Edwin Calloway, or someone who wishes us to believe Calloway is still alive?" The man's lips curled in defiance, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "You will talk, my friend," Holmes continued. "Whether it be to us or to Scotland Yard is entirely your decision. But know this, Reginald Stamford is dead, and we are very close to understanding why." A bead of sweat trickled down the man's temple. Still, he remained silent. Holmes straightened, dusting off his coat. "No matter. Watson, summon a constable. Our guest will spend the night in a cell. His tongue will loosen by morning." I turned to comply, but before I could take 2 steps, the man's hoarse voice rasped through the night. "You're wasting your time! Calloway's dead!" Holmes froze. Slowly, he turned back. "Then who paid you to pull that trigger?" The man's eyes flicked away, his jaw tightening. "I know little of the man who hired me, only that he goes by the name Mariner." Holmes's expression remained impassive, but I saw the faint tightening of his fingers against his lapel. "The Mariner," he murmured half to himself. The name was unfamiliar to me, but Holmes seemed to weigh it carefully, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that had just clicked into place. "You have done well to give me that name," he said at last, his voice low and measured, "and I suspect it will be the last service you render to your employer." With that, he turned on his heel. "Come, Watson, the fog grows thicker, and there is much work yet to be done." We left the hired gun in the custody of the night watch, his curses fading behind us as we returned to Baker Street. As the cab rattled through the sleeping city, I could not shake the lingering chill that had settled in my chest. "Holmes," I said at last, breaking the silence, "if Calloway is truly dead, who could this Mariner be?" Holmes stared out at the shrouded streets, the faint glow of his pipe, the only sign of life beneath his hat brim. "There are men, Watson," he murmured, "who operate not in the light, but in the spaces between. Ghosts given flesh, bound by revenge, by greed, or by the debts of long-forgotten crimes." He tapped his pipe against the sill. "Edwin Calloway may indeed be dead, but his ghost still walks the streets of London, and I fear that before this night is over, we shall come face to face with the man who carries that ghost's name. Near, a name in the fog." The rattling cab carried us through the mist-choked streets of London, the gas lamps glowing faintly like distant beacons in a sea of grey. Holmes sat in silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. I had come to recognize this as the state of deepest contemplation, a moment when his mind, working at a pace beyond my comprehension, unravelled a web of connections invisible to all but him. I, however, could not share in his silence. "This name, the Mariner," I said, shifting uneasily in my seat. "Who could he be? Another survivor of the Raven's Crest?" Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his eyes fixed on the window. "Possible, but unlikely. Tobias, for all his faults, would not have feared the mere mention of a fellow crewman. No, Watson, this man, the Mariner, is something else entirely. A ghost of Calloway's past, or perhaps—" He trailed off, his gaze sharpening. "Perhaps what?" Holmes turned to me, his voice low. "Perhaps he is not a ghost at all, but the architect of the entire deception." The thought sent a shiver through me. "You mean to say that Calloway's death itself could be a fabrication?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he rapped his cane sharply against the roof of the cab. "Driver, a change in direction. Take us to Scotland Yard." I started. "To Lestrade? Indeed. If my suspicions are correct, then there are records, old forgotten records, that may finally reveal the truth behind Calloway's fate." The cab jerked as the driver obeyed, turning toward the Thames. The yard never slept, and as we arrived, the grand weathered building loomed against the night sky. A lone constable at the entrance recognized us at once, waving us through. Inspector Lestrade was hunched over a desk inside, his moustache twitching as he skimmed a case file by lamplight. He glanced up as we entered, his brow creasing. "Holmes, what the devil are you doing here at this hour?" Holmes strode forward, his eyes glinting with keen urgency. "Lestrade, I require access to the old naval records, specifically those concerning a shipwreck, the Raven's Crest." Lestrade blinked, setting down his pen. The Raven's Crest? That was, what, 5-6 years ago? 7, Holmes corrected. "And I require everything you have. Crew lists, survivor reports, incident records, anything that mentions Edwin Calloway." Lestrade let out a weary sigh, rubbing his temple. "Holmes, I don't have time for one of your ghost hunts." "It is not a ghost I am hunting," Holmes interrupted, his voice cold. "It is a man who may already have killed one, and who will not hesitate to kill again." Lestrade's jaw tightened at the words. Without further protest, he gestured to a clerk, who disappeared into the archives. Minutes passed in tense silence before the man returned, carrying a bundle of old ledgers wrapped in twine. Holmes took them without ceremony, spreading them across Lestrade's desk. His fingers moved with mechanical precision, flipping pages, scanning names, discarding irrelevant details in rapid succession. I watched as the entries blurred past. Crew, lists, shipping logs, accident reports. Then, abruptly, Holmes stopped. His hand rested upon a single page, his keen eyes burning with sudden intensity. "Here," he murmured. "This is what I suspected." Lestrade and I leaned in. The paper was old, ink smudged, but the names were legible. Final crew list, the Raven's Crest captain, Edwin Calloway. First mate, Reginald Stamford deckhands, Tobias Lane, Henry Greaves, Samuel Dawn. The list went on, but Holmes's finger had halted upon one name in particular, Samuel Dawn. Status, presumed dead. A heavy silence settled over the room. "Presumed?" I echoed. Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "Indeed, Watson. Not confirmed, not buried, simply vanished." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "You think this man, Dawn, is the mariner?" Holmes leaned back, his eyes gleaming. "I do. And I believe that Stamford, in his final hours, realized his mistake. He believed he was being hunted by Edwin Calloway. But in truth, he was being hunted by the man Calloway himself had wronged. The true spectre of this mystery, Samuel Dawn." A shiver ran down my spine. Then Tobias was right. The past is still walking London's streets. Holmes nodded. "And now that we know the name of our hunter, it is only a matter of time before he strikes again." Lestrade straightened, his expression grim. "Where do we find him?" Holmes turned to the final entry on the page, the last known address of Samuel Dawn. "It appears," he murmured, closing the ledger, "that our ghost has been hiding in plain sight." He tapped the address lightly. Whitechapel. Into the lion's den. The night air in Whitechapel was thick with the scent of damp cobblestones and the acrid smoke of distant chimneys. Holmes, Lestrade, and I moved swiftly through the shadowed streets, our destination clear. An unassuming lodging-house on the eastern edge of the district. According to the naval records, it was the last known residence of Samuel Dawn, the man presumed dead, the man who now walked under the alias the Mariner. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet as we approached the building, a crumbling structure wedged between two abandoned warehouses. The flickering light of a single oil lamp in the window suggested occupancy, though whether by Dawn himself or another figure in this tangled web of deception remained to be seen. Lestrade motioned to his constables, signalling them to take position at the exits. Holmes, meanwhile, observed the building with a sharp, assessing gaze. "A place like this," I murmured, "offers a man endless ways to disappear." Holmes's lips twitched in amusement. "And yet, Watson, a man who believes himself unseen often grows careless." With that, he stepped forward and rapped sharply on the wooden door. Silence. Then, after a long pause, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from within. The door creaked open an inch, revealing a sliver of a pale, lined face. A single eye peered at us, wary, calculating. "This house is private," a voice rasped. "No lodgings available." Holmes smiled thinly. "Come now, Mr. Dawn. You have been running for 7 years. Surely you expected this visit." A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, flashed across the man's features. Then, as swiftly as he had appeared, he attempted to slam the door. Holmes was faster. With a sudden burst of force, he drove his shoulder into the wood, sending it flying open. Dawn stumbled backward, his gaunt frame colliding with a rickety table. Lestrade and I stepped inside quickly, securing the door behind us. The room was sparse, nothing but a small cot, a few scattered belongings, and a single oil lamp sputtering on the table. But what caught my attention was the desk against the far wall. It was covered in papers, maps, and a single worn letter bearing an Whodunit, old Navy seal. Holmes strode toward Dawn, his voice calm but firm. "We know who you are. We know about Calloway, and we know about the men who survived the Raven's Crest." Dawn, breathing heavily, shook his head. "You don't know a thing." Holmes lifted the letter from the desk, his eyes scanning the page. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, dangerously so. "I know that Calloway betrayed you." Dawn flinched. Holmes continued, his fingers tracing the paper. "A forged death certificate, a hidden identity. You were meant to disappear, weren't you? Buried beneath the waves along with the truth." Dawn's hands curled into fists. His voice, when it came, was hoarse with old rage. "He left me to die." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you vowed revenge." A cold silence settled between them. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, Dawn lunged for the desk. His fingers closed around the handle of a small dagger. Lestrade moved, but Holmes was faster. With a swift, calculated motion, he caught Dawn's wrist mid-strike, twisting the weapon from his grasp and sending it clattering to the floor. Dawn sagged against the desk, breathing hard. "It was never about Stamford," Holmes murmured. "You were after Calloway all along." Dawn's laugh was hollow. "The man was a snake. He sold his crew to save his own skin. When the ship went down, he made sure I was listed among the dead. Do you know what it is to be erased, Mr. Holmes? To be cast aside as though you never existed?" Holmes's gaze did not waver. And yet, here you are. Dawn exhaled sharply, staring at the floor. Stamford was my last lead to Calloway, but someone got to him before I could. I stiffened. You didn't kill him. Dawn shook his head. If I had, I wouldn't have been fool enough to stay here. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I suggest we place Mr. Dawn under protection. There is another hand in this game, one who seeks to bury the past before it speaks. Lestrade gave a reluctant nod. We'll take him in. As the constables moved to escort Dawn from the room, Holmes cast one last glance at the letter in his hand. His fingers tightened around the page. The truth was close now, but so was the man who sought to silence it. A game of shadows. Samuel, Dawn was led away under the watchful eyes of Lestrade's constables, his thin frame hunched, but his gaze defiant. Though his hands were shackled, I could not shake the uneasy feeling that we had missed something vital. Holmes, ever unreadable, stood at the threshold of the dim lodging-house, turning the letter over in his fingers. It does not fit, he murmured. Lestrade, dusting off his coat, exhaled sharply. What doesn't? Holmes tapped the paper lightly. Dawn is a man consumed by vengeance, but he is no fool. If he sought Calloway, he would have pursued him directly, not lurked in the shadows hoping Stamford would lead him there. No, Inspector, someone else is moving the pieces in this game, and they remain hidden. Lestrade frowned. You believe there's another player in this mess? Holmes's gaze flickered toward the darkened street. Not just another player, Lestrade. The true mastermind. The one who silenced Stamford. The one who ensured that Calloway would never be found. A sudden chill ran through me. You suspect Calloway is already dead. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and retrieved a small notebook. With his usual precision, he flipped through its pages until he found what he sought. He turned the book toward us, tapping a name written in neat script. Reginald Stamford? I frowned. Stamford's name? But look beneath it! Holmes interrupted. I did, and my breath caught. S. Dawn, presumed dead Calloway, presumed dead 3 men, 1 shipwreck, all lost to history, and yet someone had ensured that 2 of them never returned to the world of the living. Holmes, I began carefully, are you suggesting that Calloway's disappearance was not by accident, but by design? Holmes's smile was grim. Precisely. The ravens. Crest did not merely sink, Watson. It was silenced, and those who knew the truth of its final moments were never meant to speak again. Lestrade let out a low whistle. So Calloway, if he's still alive, he's in danger. More than that, Holmes murmured. He may very well be the last survivor of a secret someone is desperate to keep buried. A sudden thought struck me. Then Stamford wasn't killed to prevent him from leading Dawn to Calloway. He was killed because he had already found him. Holmes snapped his notebook shut. And now, Watson, we must do the same, before the killer strikes again. Lestrade straightened. And where do you propose we start? Holmes's gaze flickered toward the discarded maps and letters strewn across Dawn's desk. He picked up a worn ledger, flipping through its pages with swift efficiency. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he paused. His finger rested on an entry dated 6 weeks prior. The Mariner's Rest, Dockside Tavern, South Bank payment received. For discretion, Holmes turned to us, his eyes gleaming. "Calloway has been here." Lestrade swore under his breath. "A tavern near the docks. A man can disappear without a trace in a place like that. Precisely why we must move swiftly," Holmes replied, already stepping toward the door. "If Stamford reached him first, our killer will not be far behind." We exited the lodging-house into the cold London night, the mist curling around the gas lamps like spectral fingers. As we climbed into a waiting cab, I felt the weight of something unseen pressing upon us, the knowledge that for all our deductions, the true enemy remained in shadow. The past was still hunting, and we were running out of time. The unmasking. The cab jolted as it sped through the mist-laden streets, carrying Holmes, Lestrade and myself toward the Mariner's Rest, a dockside tavern steeped in shadows and secrecy. Holmes sat in silence, his keen gaze locked on the darkness outside, his fingers steepled in deep contemplation. The weight of the case hung over us, thick with the promise of revelation. "The answer is already before us," Holmes murmured more, to himself than to us. "The pattern is clear, Watson. We need only to set the final trap." Lestrade huffed. "I just hope we're not too late. If Calloway's still breathing, we need to find him before the murderer does." The cab lurched to a halt at the edge of the docks. The Mariner's Rest loomed ahead, its warped wooden sign creaking in the wind, a haven for seafarers and criminals alike. It was a place where questions were unwelcome, and secrets were buried deep. Holmes led the way inside. The air was thick with the scent of stale ale and salt, and the murmur of voices dimmed as we stepped through the threshold. A few wary eyes flickered toward us before turning away, uninterested. Holmes approached the barkeep, a grizzled man with a crooked nose and a knowing gaze. "We are looking for a man," Holmes said, his tone casual but firm, "a seaman who might have passed through here under the name of Calloway." The barkeep hesitated. Then, without a word, he nodded towards the back room. Holmes wasted no time. He strode forward and pushed open the door. Inside, hunched at a battered table, was a man who had once been Edward Calloway. He was gaunt, his skin weathered, his eyes sunken with years of hardship. A flickering oil lamp cast his shadow against the far wall, his hands trembling as he nursed a drink. As we stepped inside, he barely lifted his gaze. "I knew someone would come," he muttered. "I just never knew whether it'd be to save me or to finish the job." Holmes studied him closely. "You know why we're here?" Detour exhaled, setting his glass down. "I suppose I do." He leaned forward, his voice a whisper. The Raven's Crest was no ordinary ship. We were carrying something valuable, too valuable. The wreck wasn't an accident, it was arranged. Lestrade stiffened. Arranged by whom? Calloway hesitated. Then, with a voice laden with certainty, he uttered a name that froze the air around us. Sir Reginald Stamford. The shock must have shown on my face. Stamford? But he was murdered. Holmes, however, did not flinch. His expression was eerily calm. Of course he was, Watson, because he was cleaning up loose ends. Calloway nodded, grimly. We were smuggling gold. War gold. Stamford was in on it from the beginning. But when the ship went down, he wanted to ensure no one ever came looking. He had me declared dead, had Dawn written off, paid men to stay silent. Lestrade swore under his breath, and when Dawn started sniffing around, Stamford panicked. Holmes's voice was like a blade, which means Stamford's murder was no random act of violence. It was the final cover-up. He knew too much. Someone silenced him before he could be exposed. Calloway swallowed. And now they're coming for me. At that precise moment, the back door burst open. A dark figure lunged into the room, pistol drawn. Holmes moved instantly, knocking the table sideways and sending Calloway sprawling to the ground. The gun fired, shattering the lamp and plunging the room into darkness. The chaos that followed was swift. I heard the scuffle of boots, a grunt of pain, the unmistakable sound of Holmes grappling with the assailant. Lestrade charged forward, and with a single decisive crack, the struggle ended. When the dust settled, Lestrade struck a match, revealing the face of our attacker. It was Inspector Charles Dunwich, one of Lestrade's own men. Holmes's lips curled into a humorless smile. I suspected as much. Stamford's ally within the yard, the final piece of the puzzle. Dunwich, breathing heavily, glared at Holmes. "You should have left this alone." Lestrade seized his arms. "And you should have chosen your company more wisely." The rest was procedural. Dunwich was taken into custody, and Calloway was placed under protection. The truth of the Raven's Crest was finally unearthed, though many of its secrets would remain buried at sea. As we departed the tavern, Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "A man's past has a way of catching up to him, Watson. Stamford tried to outmaneuver his fate, but in the end he fell to the very game he played." I sighed. "And Dawn? Do you think he'll ever find peace?" Holmes shook his head. "Perhaps, but men like him, men who have been erased by the world, they seldom fade quietly." With that, we stepped into the London night, the mist swirling around us, carrying the echoes of a mystery now solved. Another case closed, but the game would never be over.